tonight we are stepping into a world where the word normal meant something truly, deeply unhinged. We are talking about Victorian England, that buttoned up, lace curtained, seemingly proper era that was secretly one of the most bizarre, disgusting, and absurdly dangerous times to be alive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. A massive, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and frankly, you have excellent taste in historical horror. Your suggestions are the engine that keeps this whole thing running, and I mean that sincerely. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is. It is somehow always 2 in the morning for someone. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan, get yourself horizontal, and tuck those feet in. Not because of rats this time, but because of what the Victorians did to feet. We will get to that, but first, let us pause and consider a few important questions. Did Victorians really put arsenic in their wallpaper and think that was perfectly fine? Did they actually carry dead hair around in lockets as a romantic gesture? Was there a moment in history when a piano leg was considered too provocative to leave uncovered? Why did they think photographing corpses was a lovely family activity? Could you survive a dinner party where the table centerpiece was a human skull? Were children regularly given cocaine for a cough? And did anyone raise so much as a single eyebrow? How did a woman get dressed in the morning when getting dressed took 45 minutes, required a second human being, and involved a corset strong enough to crack a rib? Congratulations. You have just woken up in 1852. You have a top hat, a chest infection, a handful of arsenic-laced sweets, and approximately 0 reasons to feel confident about your odds. Welcome to Victorian England. Try not to breathe too deeply. Let us talk about your walls, not in a poetic, introspective way, but in a you are being slowly poisoned by your decor way. The Victorians had a deep, almost romantic obsession with a shade of green so vivid and so gloriously bold it looked like someone had wrung out an emerald. They called it Sheely's green, and they put it absolutely everywhere. Wallpaper, curtains, candles, artificial flowers, children's toys, ball gowns, cake decorations. The problem, and it was a fairly significant one, was that this magnificent green was made using arsenic, not trace amounts. Substantial, enthusiastic quantities of arsenic cheerfully printed onto the surfaces of every room in the house and left there to quietly off-gas into the lungs of the entire family. Victorian households reported mysterious headaches, nausea, fatigue, and a persistent sense of being unwell that doctors blamed on everything from moral weakness to bad air. They were not entirely wrong about the bad air. They were simply wrong about where it was coming from. The culprit was a specific fungus that colonized damp wallpaper and converted the arsenic compounds in the dye into a volatile gas called trimethylarsine, which then drifted through the room in concentrations low enough to be invisible and high enough to make everyone in the house feel inexplicably terrible on a permanent basis. Doctors visited, doctors puzzled. Doctors occasionally prescribed a change of air, which worked because the change of air meant you had temporarily left your house, which was the actual problem. To be fair to the Victorians, some of them did suspect the wallpaper. As early as 1858, a chemist named William Odling stood up at a public meeting and pointed directly at the green dye as a likely cause of household illness. He was heard politely and then largely ignored because the wallpaper was beautiful, the illness was vague, and redecorating was expensive and inconvenient. This is, if you think about it, a very recognizable human response to inconvenient information. The scale of the problem was significant. By the 1870s, it was estimated that somewhere in the region of 100 million square yards of arsenic-dyed wallpaper had been produced in Britain alone. That is not a small number. That is enough arsenic-laced wallpaper to cover a substantial portion of the country's interior walls, which is in fact precisely what had happened. And it was not just wallpaper. The same dye appeared in the green baize covering card tables, in the artificial flowers women wore in their hair at parties, and in the tissue paper used to wrap confectionery. On a reasonably fashionable Victorian evening out, you could be exposed to arsenic via your walls, your table centerpiece, the flowers in your hostess's hair, and the paper wrapped around the sweets on the table. The campaign to remove arsenic from dyes was slow, contested, and only partially successful. Manufacturers argued there was no definitive proof. Retailers argued that demand was too high to stop, and fashionable consumers continued to buy the green wallpaper because it was genuinely, undeniably beautiful, and the headaches could be attributed to any number of things. William Morris. Yes, that. William Morris, the iconic designer, whose floral wallpaper patterns remain beloved to this day, used arsenic green dyes in several of his designs well into the 1880s. Despite mounting evidence of the hazard, and despite the fact that his own family owned a copper and arsenic mining company, which may or may not have influenced his relaxed attitude toward the entire situation, the arsenic wallpaper problem was eventually resolved less by regulation and more by fashion. A new era of synthetic dyes arrived. The green fell out of vogue, and future generations simply replaced the old paper with new paper and thought nothing more about it. The headaches presumably cleared up. The walls looked lovely, and no one asked too many questions about what the previous generation had been breathing for 40 years. In the Victorian era, grief was not just an emotion, it was a craft project. When a loved one died, it was not considered morbid, unusual, or in any way alarming to take a lock of their hair, braid it, press it under glass, and wear it around your neck for the rest of your natural life. In fact, it was expected. Mourning jewelry was a booming industry. You could have hair woven into rings, brooches, bracelets, earrings, or elaborate framed displays hung on your parlor wall like a beloved portrait. Except the portrait was made of dead person. Jewelers offered catalogs, families compared pieces, and if you were particularly committed to the aesthetic, you might commission a piece combining hair from multiple deceased relatives into a single arrangement, which is either deeply touching or extremely unsettling depending on your perspective, and also on whether any of them died of something contagious. The practice had roots that predated Victoria, but the Queen herself turned mourning into a national art form. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria did not simply grieve. She institutionalized it. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She slept with a cast of Albert's hand beside her. She had his clothes laid out on his side of the bed every morning for decades. And she insisted that hot water for shaving be brought to his room each day, as though he might yet appear and require it. A nation that already had strong feelings about the correct expression of bereavement took one look at their queen and concluded that they had, if anything, been underselling it. Hair specifically held a particular significance. It was the part of a person that survived longest. It did not decay. It did not change. It remained, in some essential way, the person, tangible, warm in color, recognizably theirs. A lock of a child's hair pressed into a locket was a way of keeping the child close after everything else was gone. And given Victorian child mortality rates, this was not a comfort that only a few families required. The craftsmanship involved could be extraordinary. Hair was braided into intricate patterns, woven into floral motifs, coiled into miniature landscapes, or twisted into fine chains, indistinguishable from gold wire at first glance. Professional hair workers, a recognized trade, could produce pieces of genuine technical beauty. Ladies' magazines published instructions for amateur versions, turning haircraft into a domestic skill alongside embroidery and watercolor, another quiet afternoon activity for women in an era when quiet afternoon activities were both expected and mandatory. Men wore it too, in signet rings with a compartment behind the stone, in watch fobs, or in small brooches worn close to the body. The sentiment crossed class lines. A factory worker might have a single lock knotted into a simple frame, just as a duchess might commission an elaborate brooch in jet and gold. The grief was the same. The budget varied. What strikes a modern observer, beyond the obvious strangeness, is how direct it was. There was no metaphor here, no flowers standing in for the loss, no symbolic object gesturing at absence. It was the person, physically. You wore the person, you carried the person, and the Victorian world looked at this practice and found it not strange, but proper, a correct and dignified acknowledgement that some losses do not diminish and should not be asked to. Whether your modern self would have worn a brooch made of your grandmother's hair is a question worth sitting with quietly in the dark. The Victorian medicine cabinet was a remarkable place. If you were tired, there was something for that. The fainting couch at the end of all this starts to seem less like a piece of furniture and more like a quiet act of mercy. The ideal Victorian complexion was pale, not just fair, not just light, but almost translucently white, as though you had been assembled entirely indoors from materials that had never encountered sunlight. And in pursuit of this ideal, Victorian women did things to their faces that would make a modern dermatologist physically leave the room. Lead-based foundation, called pearl powder or Venetian ceruse, was applied generously to the skin to achieve that ghostly brightness everyone was after. The lead absorbed into the skin over time, causing hair loss, skin lesions, tremors, and eventual organ damage. When women began showing symptoms of lead poisoning, doctors noted the deterioration with concern and sometimes recommended they use less powder. The women mostly did not. Separately, arsenic wafers, small tablets containing actual arsenic, were sold as complexion improvers on the logic that arsenic suppressed blood flow to the skin surface and kept it looking fashionably bloodless. The Victorian beauty industry was, in essence, a slow and decorative race to the bottom. The paleness preference had a logic to it, even if the methods for achieving it were catastrophically misguided. In a society where working outdoors in sun and weather was synonymous with agricultural labor and low social status, a pale complexion visually communicated leisure, wealth, and a life lived in drawing rooms. A woman who tanned was a woman who had to be outside. A woman who remained white was a woman who had somewhere comfortable to be. This distinction was considered important enough that generations of women poisoned themselves to preserve it. Belladonna, deadly nightshade, was used as eye drops to dilate the pupils, making the eyes appear larger and more luminous, which was considered attractive. The side effects of regular belladonna use included blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and over time, damage to the eyes and optic nerve. Users were not always warned. The name belladonna, meaning beautiful woman in Italian, suggests that whoever coined it had their priorities arranged in a fairly specific order. Red lips were achieved through dyes and tints that sometimes contained mercury. Rouges for the cheeks used carmine, cochineal, or in cheaper preparations, compounds that irritated and eventually damaged the skin they were applied to. The fashionable Victorian woman, in her full cosmetic armor, was wearing a collection of substances that read, in retrospect, like a very specific kind of slow harm delivered in daily increments and framed as self-improvement. What makes it particularly remarkable is that by the mid-Victorian era, the connection between lead and illness was reasonably well established. The Victorians were not entirely ignorant of toxicology. They knew lead was dangerous in paint, in pipes, in food tins. They simply maintained a careful separation between that knowledge and the powder they applied to their faces every morning, in the same way that people maintain certain careful separations to this day between things they know and things they prefer to continue doing. The beauty industry has changed considerably since then. The specific poisons are different now, but the basic structure. Here is a product that promises to make you more acceptable, and here is the small print you're invited not to read too carefully, has proven to be remarkably durable. Victorian dentistry operated on the basic principle that if something hurts badly enough, you remove it and deal with the consequences later. There was no anesthesia for most of the era. Ether did not arrive until the 1840s, and even then it was not universally trusted or available, which meant that having a tooth pulled was exactly as horrifying as you are currently imagining. Performed with iron instruments by a man who might also cut your hair. The result was that many Victorians simply lost their teeth or had them pulled prophylactically before they had the chance to become a problem, in the same spirit with which someone might cancel plans before they have the chance to go badly. Wealthy Victorians replaced their missing teeth with dentures, which sounds more civilized until you learn where the teeth in those dentures came from. After major battles, particularly Waterloo in 1815, tooth hunters moved across the battlefields pulling teeth from the dead. These were cleaned, shaped, and sold to dentists who used them to make dentures for paying customers. Waterloo teeth were, for a time, a specific recognized product. The demand for human teeth exceeded what battlefields alone could supply. London's body snatchers, resurrectionists, they preferred, who dug up fresh graves to sell bodies to medical schools, routinely removed the teeth first, since teeth could be sold separately and quickly, without the legal complications that came with a full corpse. In some cases, the very poor sold their own teeth while still alive to dentists who could transplant them into the mouths of wealthier patients. This transplantation practice had the additional feature of occasionally transmitting syphilis from donor to recipient, which is the kind of consequence that gives medical innovations their mixed historical reputations. By the mid-Victorian era, porcelain teeth were becoming more common, which was a genuine improvement. not for aesthetic reasons, though porcelain was more convincing, but because human and animal teeth came with their own structural issues, including the tendency to decay in the mouth of the person wearing them just as enthusiastically as they had decayed in the mouth of whoever had previously owned them. Sugar, meanwhile, was becoming more affordable and more widely consumed throughout the Victorian era. The result, across a population with no fluoride, no dental hygiene education, no accessible professional dental care, and an increasingly sweet diet, was predictable. Victorian skulls recovered by archaeologists show extensive decay, significant tooth loss, and a pattern of dental health that deteriorates markedly across the century as sugar consumption rises. By the time of the First World War, the dental health of British military recruits was sufficiently alarming that it prompted official reports. The Army began providing dental care. Schools began teaching children to brush their teeth. The connection between what you eat, what you clean, and whether you keep your teeth into old age slowly became public knowledge, information that arrived, as these things often do, somewhat after the damage was done. The Victorians had rules for everything, not guidelines, not gentle suggestions, rules, codified and published in thick etiquette manuals that middle-class families consulted with the seriousness of legal documents. There were rules for how to enter a room, how to leave a room, how to stand in a room, and how long you were permitted to stand there before it became peculiar. There were rules governing the precise angle at which a calling card should be left on a silver tray, the number of days one was obligated to wait before returning a social call, and the specific shade of mourning, black appropriate at various intervals after a death, full black for the first year, then half mourning, which permitted muted purples and grays before you were finally permitted to ease back into actual colors, like a person slowly reintegrating into society after something had gone wrong. The etiquette manual industry was substantial. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, published in 1861, remains famous but was by no means alone. Dozens of competing manuals addressed every possible social scenario with the thoroughness of legal commentaries, often contradicting one another on specific points, and thereby creating a secondary anxiety about which authority to follow when the authorities disagreed. The manuals addressed table settings, the correct order of service at dinner, how to introduce people of different social ranks without accidentally suggesting an equivalence that did not exist, how to decline an invitation without causing offense, how to accept an invitation while communicating a mild lack of enthusiasm, and how to write a letter of condolence that was warm enough to be genuine without being so specific that it raised uncomfortable questions. The letter had rules that occupied entire chapters. The address was formatted precisely. The salutation was calibrated to the relationship. The closing was selected from a hierarchy that ranged from yours faithfully, used for those you did not know personally, down through yours sincerely, yours truly, yours affectionately, and yours ever, each carrying a distinct social weight that the recipient was expected to parse correctly. Sending too warm a closing to someone of higher rank was presumptuous. Sending too formal a closing to a friend was cold. Getting it wrong communicated something, even if the letter itself said nothing of consequence. The function of all this, beneath its elaborate surface, was the function of a code, to separate those who knew it from those who did not, and to allow the former to identify the latter without saying so directly. Etiquette was, in its practical operation, a class sorting mechanism delivered through the medium of which fork you picked up first. And if this sounds exhausting, you are correct. It was entirely exhausting. The Victorians knew it was exhausting. They did it anyway, every day, with straight backs and unrevealing expressions. Because the alternative, a world in which anyone could walk into any room and be received on their own terms, was considerably more frightening than the rules. Victorian childhood, for a significant portion of the population, did not involve toys, schooling, or any extended period of play. It involved work. If your baby was teething and would not stop crying at 3 in the morning, and honestly, who could blame the baby? There was absolutely something for that. That something was laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, available over the counter at any pharmacy, marketed to adults and children alike, with the casual confidence of a brand selling flavored throat lozenges. It was prescribed for headaches, menstrual cramps, coughs, diarrhea, grief, hysteria, insomnia, and what Victorian doctors cheerfully described as nervousness. Mothers dabbed it on their gums, nurses gave it to infants, and the general public purchased it by the bottle, took it by the spoonful, and then wondered why they felt a little foggy and could not quite face the day without it. The dosing instructions, where they existed at all, were approximate in a way that should have given someone pause. Bottles instructed users to take a few drops, which is not a unit of measurement that inspires confidence when the active ingredient is opium. The strength varied between batches and between manufacturers. A dose that did nothing for a habitual user could send a first-time user into respiratory distress, a fact that was known to pharmacists and generally not printed on the label. Thomas de Quincey published his Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821, describing in considerable sensory detail what it felt like to take laudanum recreationally and then find that you could not stop. The book was widely read, somewhat scandalous, and had essentially no effect on laudanum's popularity, which continued to grow throughout the century. Elizabeth Barrett Browning took it for years. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was famously dependent on it. Wilkie Collins, who wrote some of the most gripping Victorian detective fiction, consumed it in such quantities that he eventually claimed to see a doppelganger of himself following him around, which is the kind of symptom that might suggest a reassessment of the treatment plan. Working class. Families used laudanum for a specific and not entirely unsympathetic purpose, keeping children quiet. A woman working a factory shift for 12 hours had in many cases no alternative childcare and no way to bring the child to work. A small amount of laudanum in a teething baby's gum, or a slightly larger amount in what was sold as a soothing syrup, produced a sedated infant who would not cry and would not require immediate attention. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed specifically for teething children, contained morphine and alcohol and was sold across Britain and America for decades. The label described it as perfectly harmless. It was not perfectly harmless. The babies did stop crying, though. And in a household with thin walls, long hours, and no concept of parental leave, that counted for something. The eventual decline of over-the-counter opiates came not through immediate moral reckoning, but through slow legislative pressure. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 required that certain drugs, including opium, be sold only by registered pharmacists, which was a start, though it did not restrict who could buy them or in what quantities. Full regulation came considerably later. In the meantime, the Victorian household coped with its various aches, anxieties, and sleepless infants the way it coped with most things, with chemical assistance, minimal questioning, and a firm belief that if something was available for purchase at a reputable establishment, it was probably fine. Here is something the Victorians did that will require you to sit with it for a moment. When someone died, they sometimes propped the body up, dressed it in its best clothes, arranged it in a natural-looking pose, and then gathered the remaining living family members around it for a photograph. This was called post-mortem photography, and it was not fringe behavior. It was a mainstream, widely practiced, socially acceptable way of preserving the memory of the deceased, particularly children, at a time when photography was expensive and many people had no other images of their loved ones. Photographers offered specific services for it. Studios were equipped for it. Families scheduled sessions around it. Some photographs are remarkably peaceful. A child arranged as if sleeping, hands folded, expression serene. Others are more ambitious, with the deceased seated upright, eyes propped open with small devices, posed between living relatives, who are all smiling as though nothing unusual is happening, because to them, nothing unusual was. Photography arrived in the 1830s, and for most of the Victorian era, it was expensive enough that a sitting was a significant occasion rather than a casual one. Many working-class families had their photograph taken once, maybe twice in a lifetime. For families who had lost a child before any photograph existed, which was common given the mortality rates, the death of that child was, counterintuitively, the moment at which a photograph became both possible and necessary. The techniques photographers developed for the purpose were practical, and in their own way, thoughtful. Stands were designed to hold a body upright, eyelids were propped, or in some cases eyes were painted onto the closed lids in the finished photograph to make the subject appear awake. Poses were drawn from portraiture conventions, seated in a favorite chair, resting on a chaise, held by a parent. The surrounding family was arranged naturally, siblings on either side, a mother's hand on a shoulder, so that the image looked from a certain angle and with a certain willingness not to look too closely, like a family portrait from a Sunday afternoon. The practice declined as photography became cheaper and more common. Once a family could afford to photograph their children while alive, the post-mortem portrait became less of a necessity. By the early 20th century, it had become unusual, then rare, then the kind of thing people came across in old boxes of family photographs and did not quite know what to make of. What you do know, looking at them now, is that someone stood in a room that smelled of preserving chemicals and grief, arranged the person they loved into the best imitation of life they could manage, and asked a photographer to make it last. The technology was new. The impulse was not, people have always wanted to hold on. The Victorians just had a particularly literal method. Getting dressed in the Victorian era was less of a morning routine and more of an endurance test with a small audience. For women, the centerpiece of the whole production was the corset, a rigid, heavily boned contraption laced tight enough to compress the waist by several inches, rearrange the internal organs into creative new configurations, and make deep breathing a theoretical rather than practical activity. This was not a secret. Victorian doctors wrote extensively about The physical damage caused by tight lacing, compressed livers, displaced stomachs, fractured lower ribs, difficulty breathing, chronic fainting, and in response to this rather conclusive evidence, fashionable Victorian women continued wearing corsets, while also purchasing fainting couches, long, low, elegant pieces of furniture specifically designed to catch you when your clothing made you pass out. The fainting couch was not a quirk, it was infrastructure. To understand why the corset persisted in the face of mounting medical criticism, you have to understand what it represented in Victorian social logic. A small waist was not merely an aesthetic preference. It was evidence of moral character, self-restraint, discipline, refinement. A woman who laced tightly demonstrated that she was not the kind of woman who let herself go. The fact that the discipline involved was essentially a passive one. You simply wore the object and it did the restraining for you, was not considered to undermine the point. You still had to put it on every morning and endure it every day, which was its own kind of commitment. The tight lacing debate divided Victorian society into two passionate camps. On one side, the anti-corset reformers, doctors, dress reformers, and early feminists who published pamphlets, letters to newspapers, and illustrated guides showing what corsets did to the internal architecture of the human torso. Some of these illustrations were genuinely alarming, showing ribs migrating, organs shifting, spines curving into shapes they were not designed to achieve. On the other side, women who wore corsets and who wrote letters to fashion magazines, defending them in terms ranging from aesthetic to practical to remarkably medical, arguing that the support provided by a well-fitted corset was beneficial rather than harmful, and that their doctors agreed. Some doctors did agree, which tells you something about the medical profession of the era. The getting dressed process beyond the corset was also simply enormous. A fully dressed fashionable Victorian woman wore, in rough sequence, a chemise, drawers, a corset cover, a crinoline or bustle depending on the decade, a petticoat or several, a dress with its own internal structure and a trained skirt behind, sleeves that required their own fitting and often their own internal support, a collar, a brooch, gloves, and a hat that needed to be pinned to the hair with hat pins long enough to be classified in a later era as potential weapons. Undressing at the end of the day, working through all of this in reverse, and with the corset laces finally released, was described in Victorian diaries with a specificity that suggests it was one of the more physically satisfying moments of the day. The expansion of lungs suddenly permitted to fill completely, the spine permitted to resume its natural curvature, the slow, luxurious return to a body that was temporarily your own again. Very young children, sometimes as young as 5 or 6, were employed in coal mines, factories, and chimneys, not because the Victorians were universally monstrous, but because the economy ran on cheap, small labor, and no one had yet passed a law saying it should not. In coal mines, children called trappers sat alone in complete darkness for shifts of up to 12 hours, operating ventilation doors by pulling a string. They did not move. They could not see. They simply sat and pulled the string when they heard a cart coming. Slightly older children worked as hurriers, bent double, dragging coal carts through tunnels too low for adults. Climbing boys, chimney sweeps, were sent up chimneys that were actively warm, sometimes lit, to dislodge soot with their bodies. The work caused spinal deformities, lung disease, and a specific cancer of the scrotum, so common among chimney sweeps that it became known simply as chimney sweeps cancer. This was not considered a national emergency. It was considered Tuesday. The coal mine testimony, collected by parliamentary commissioners in 1842, which eventually led to the Mines Act of that year, is some of the most striking historical documentation of the period. Children were asked about their working conditions and answered with the plainness of people describing something entirely unremarkable. A boy of 7 said he worked from 4 in the morning until 5 in the evening. A girl of 8 said she had been doing so since she was 5. They described the darkness, the cold water that collected in low tunnels, the rats, the weight of the cart harness worn across the chest and hips, and the punishment administered when a load arrived late. They described it all without complaint, because complaint required the concept that things might be otherwise, and they had been working in mines since before they had developed that concept. The commissioners were disturbed enough by what they found that they published illustrations alongside the testimony, drawings of children dragging carts on all fours through low passages, girls in harnesses pulling loads that outweighed them. The illustrations were distributed publicly and generated genuine outrage among the middle-class reading public, which is how public outrage generally worked in the Victorian era. It required the thing to be made visible to people who had chosen not to look directly at it. The Mines Act of 1842 prohibited boys under 10 and all girls and women from working underground. This was understood at the time as a significant reform. Boys of 10 and above continued working underground. Compulsory education, which arrived in stages from 1870 onward, was probably the single most effective intervention. Not because it changed attitudes about child labor directly, but because it occupied children's time with school and made the casual use of very young children in full-time work practically difficult. By the end of the century, the 9-year-old trapper, sitting alone in the dark with a string, was becoming a historical image rather than a current fact. It had taken the better part of 60 years and required being shown the pictures before anyone in a position to act found it sufficiently unacceptable to act. Before the flush toilet arrived in Victorian homes, the solution to human waste management in cities was essentially to produce it, ignore it, and let it become someone else's problem downstream. London in the early Victorian era operated on the cesspit system. Pits dug beneath houses, theoretically emptied by night soil men, practically overflowing into neighboring foundations, basements, and eventually the Thames. The river, which was also the city's primary water source, became so foul by the middle of the 19th century that Parliament itself had to suspend its sessions during what became known as the Great Stink of 1858, because the smell rising from the water directly outside the building was too aggressive for lawmakers to remain in the same building and still function. This was eventually the event that prompted the construction of London's sewage system. Before that, a city of 5 million people had been essentially living inside its own waste, and no one had found this quite alarming enough to act on. The Great Stink is one of those historical events that functions as a perfect parable about the gap between knowing something is a problem and finding it bad enough to fix. Londoners had known the Thames was polluted for decades. They had also known, since Dr. John Snow's meticulous epidemiological work during the 1854 Broad Street cholera outbreak, that contaminated water caused cholera, the disease that killed tens of thousands of Londoners periodically throughout the century. The public health reformer Edwin Chadwick had been writing reports about sanitary conditions and their relationship to disease since the 1840s. The information was not hidden. It was in reports. It was in newspapers. Parliament took action when the smell reached their windows, not before. The engineer Joseph Bazalgette designed a sewage system for London. 83 miles of main sewers, over 1,000 miles of smaller street sewers, and pumping stations to move waste downstream and away from the city's water intake points. Construction began in 1859 and took a decade. The system still functions today. Bazalgette has a plaque on the embankment. He deserves considerably more than a plaque. The combination of clean water supply and waste removal infrastructure that appeared gradually across Victorian Britain over the second half of the century was statistically the single most significant public health intervention of the era, more significant than any medical advance, more significant than any pharmaceutical development. Clean water and functional sewage reduced cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and infant mortality in ways that nothing else of the period came close to matching. The Victorians got there eventually. They just needed the smell to reach the people who could write the checks. Once Victorian doctors got their hands on electricity, which happened sometime in the mid-1800s, they became wildly optimistic about what it could cure. The answer, in their view, was almost everything. Electric belts were sold as treatments for impotence, back pain, rheumatism, kidney disease, and what was broadly described as weakness. You strapped a battery to your body, ran a current through it, and waited to feel improved. Electric baths existed, in which you sat in water, through which a mild current was passed. Electric hairbrushes promised to stimulate the scalp and restore lost hair. Doctors administered electric shocks to paralyzed limbs with genuine therapeutic intent, which occasionally helped and occasionally made things significantly worse in ways that were not always immediately apparent. Electric corsets were sold to women with the promise that the current would tighten and tone the body beneath, which would have been astonishing if true, and was in fact not true. The enthusiasm made a certain kind of sense given the context. Electricity was new, invisible, powerful, and not yet fully understood by anyone. It made things move that had not moved. It produced light from nothing. It crossed distances instantaneously in ways that felt, to a generation encountering it for the first time, genuinely miraculous. If electricity could power a telegraph, illuminate a room, and drive a motor, it was not obviously unreasonable to suppose it might also fix a bad back. The logic was wrong, but the leap was understandable, and the Victorian medical establishment made it with both feet and considerable enthusiasm. The electric belt was perhaps the most commercially successful of the electrical health products manufactured by several competing companies and advertised extensively in newspapers and popular magazines. It consisted of a series of zinc and copper discs arranged in a belt worn against the skin, which generated a mild galvanic current when moistened by perspiration. The advertisements promised restoration of vitality, relief from nervous exhaustion, and improvement in a range of conditions described with a coyness that suggested the actual complaint was something the advertiser preferred not to name directly. The target market was men experiencing what the era called loss of manly vigor, a phrase that requires no further elaboration. Legitimate medical uses of electricity did exist and were developed alongside the quackery, galvanism, using electrical current to stimulate muscle contraction had genuine applications in treating certain types of paralysis, and some of the work done in Victorian medical electricity contributed to later developments in physiotherapy and cardiac treatment. The problem was that the legitimate uses and the fraudulent ones coexisted in the same marketplace, described in the same language, sold by practitioners whose credentials were equally difficult to verify. The Victorians characteristically believed it completely, bought the belt, sat in the bath, brushed their hair with the special brush, and waited for the improvement that was surely just a few more volts away. Victorians took death seriously, aggressively, elaborately, socially seriously. When a member of a household died, the expectations were immediate and comprehensive. Mirrors were covered, so the soul could not become trapped in its own reflection. Clocks were stopped at the moment of death. They lived in the cracks of a brilliant, brutal, astonishing era, and they kept going anyway, the way people do, because the morning came and there was work, and because what else do you do? The Victorian world is over. Its wallpaper has been stripped, its cesspits filled, its patent medicines regulated into memory. The arsenic is gone from the walls. Sleep well. You made it through